Namaste. So tonight I'm going to read Book 9, Chapter 33, on the description of the destinies of different sinners in different hells in the Maha Devi Bhagavatam. Om Vakrata Makaya Koti Surya Samaprabha Niravaganam. Om Guru Brahma Guru Vishnu. Hari Om Tat Sat. Dharmarajan said, those that are in Hari's service pure, the siddhas in yoga, those that have attained success in yoga, the performers of vrats, vows, the chaste, the ascetics, the brahmacharis never go to hells. There's no doubt in this. Those persons that are proud of their strong positions and who use very harsh burning words to their friends, they go to Vanikunda and live there for as many years as there are hairs on his body. Next, they attain animal births for 3 births and get themselves scorched under the strong heat of the sun. He goes to the Tapta Kunda hell, who does not entertain any Brahmin guest with any eatables, who comes to his house hungry and thirsty. He lives there for as many hells as there are hairs on his body, and he has to sleep on a bed of fire, very tormenting. Then he who have to be born for 7 births as birds, if anybody washes any clothing with any salt on Sunday or on the day of Sankranti, when the sun enters another sign, or on any new moon day, or on any Shraddha day, when funeral ceremonies are performed, he will have to go to the Kasara Kunda hell, where he remains for as many years as there are threads in that clothing, and finally he becomes born for 7 births as a veritable washerman. The wretch that abuses Mula Prakriti, the Vedas, the Sastras, Puranas, Brahma, Vishnu, Shiva, and the other Devas, Gauri, Lakshmi, Saraswati, and the other Devis, goes to the hell named Bhayanaka, Naraka Kunda. There is no other hell more tormenting than this. The sinners live here for many kalpas and ultimately become serpents. There is no sin greater than the abuse of the Devi. There is no expiation for it. So one ought never to abuse the Devi. If one discontinues the allowances given by oneself or other persons to the Devas or Brahmanas, one goes to Vistakunda and has to eat the feces there for 60,000 years, and finally to be born in Bharata as worms in feces the same number of years. If any person without the owner's permission digs another's tank dried of water or makes water in the water of any tank, he goes to Mutrakunda and drinks urine for as many years as there are the particles in that tank. Then he becomes born in this Bharata. It's as an ox for 100 years. If any person eats good things himself without giving any portion thereof to the member of his family, he goes to Slisma Kunda, where he eats falm for full 100 years. Then he becomes born as Preta, disembodied spirits, in this Bharata for 100 years, and drinks falm, urine and pus. Then he becomes pure. He who does not support his father, mother, spiritual teacher, wife, sons, daughters, and the helpless persons, goes to Garakunda, where he eats poison for full 100 years. Finally, he becomes born and wanders as bhutas, disembodied spirits. Then he becomes pure. He who becomes angry and shrinks his eyes at the sight of a guest who has come to his house offends the Devas and Pitris, who do not accept the water offered to them by that villain. On the contrary, he earns all the sins of Brahmahatya, murder of a Brahmin and so forth, and finally goes to Dusika Kunda, where he remains for 100 years and eats polluted things. Then, wandering as Bhutas for 100 years, he becomes purified. If anybody makes a gift of any article to a Brahmin and then again gives that article to a different man, he goes to Vasakunda, where he eats marrows for 100 years. Then he has to roam about in India for 7 births as a Krikalasa lizard. And finally he becomes born as a very poor man with a very short life. If any woman or any man makes another of a different sex eat semen out of passion, he goes to Shukrakunda, where he drinks semen for 100 years. He then crawls about as worms for 100 years. He then gets purified, and then he gets purified. If anybody beats a Brahmana who is a family preceptor and causes his blood to come out, he will have to go to Raktakunda, where he has to drink blood for 100 years. Finally, he has to roam about for 7 births in India as tigers. Then he becomes pure by degrees. If anybody mocks and laughs at any devotee of Krishna who sings with rapt consciousness and sheds tears of joy, he will have to go to Ashrukunda, where he drinks tears for 100 years. Then he has to roam as Chandala for 3 births, and then he becomes pure. He who always cheats his friends lives for 100 years in Katramala Kunda, then roaming about for 3 births as an ass and for 3 births as a fox. Concurrently, he becomes purified. Out of vanity, if anybody jests at a deaf person, he goes to Karnamalakunda, where he eats for 100 years the wax of the air. Next, he comes to the earth as a deaf and very poor man for 7 births. When at last he gets purified, if anybody commits murder out of greed to support his family, he goes to the hell, Majakunda, where he eats marrow for 1,00,000 years. Next, he becomes a fish for 7 births. For 7 births, he becomes a mosquito. For 3 births, he becomes a boar. For 7 births, he becomes a cock, deer, and other animals. Concurrently, at last, he gets purified. If any stupid person sells the daughter whom he has supported out of greed for money, he goes to Mansakunda and lives there for as many years as there are hairs on her body. The Yama's servants beat him with their clubs. His head becomes overloaded with the burden of the flesh, and out of hunger he licks the blood coming out of his head. Next, that sinner comes to Bharata and for 60 years becomes a worm in any daughter's feces. For 7 births, he becomes a hunter. For 3 births, a boar. For 7 births, cock. For 7 births, frog. For 7 births, leech. And for 7 births, crow, when he gets purified. One who shaves on the day of observing vows, fasting and funeral ceremony day becomes impure and unfit to do any action, and in the end he goes to Nakakunda, where he receives blows and clubs and eats nails for 100 Deva years. If anybody worships out of carelessness the earthen Shiva Palik symbol with any hairs on it, he goes to the hell Kesakunda, where he remains for as many years as there are particles in that hair. Then he gets to the yoni womb, a Yavanani, a Mlacha woman, out of Hara's wrath. After 100 years, he becomes freed from that, and then he becomes a Rakshasa. There is no doubt in this. He who does not offer pindas to the Vishnupada in honor of his Pitris at Gaya goes to the hell Astikunda, where he remains for as many years as there are dirts on his body. Then he becomes a man for the 7 births. He becomes lame and poor. Then he gets purified. The stupid man who commits outrage and violence on his pregnant wife resides for 100 years in the hot Tamrakunda, where coppers are in a molten condition. He who takes the food of a childless widow and the same of any woman that has just bathed after menstruation goes for 100 years to the hot Lauha Kunda, where iron is in a molten condition. For 7 births he becomes then a crow, and for 7 births he becomes born of a washerwoman, full of sores and boils and poor. Then he gets purified. If one touches the things of the devas after touching skins or impure hides, or remains in the Charma Kunda for full 100 years, if any Brahmin eats a Sudra's food requested by him, he lives for 100 years in the hot Surakunda. Then for 7 births he performs the funeral rites for a Sudra. At last he becomes pure. If any foul-mouthed person uses always harsh and filthy language to his master, he will have to go to the Tiksna Kantaka Kunda, where he eats thorns. Besides, the Yama servants give severe beatings to him with their clubs. For 7 births, he will have to become horses when he gets purified. If any man ministers poison to another and so takes away his life, he will have to remain for endless years in Visakunda, where he will have to eat poison. Then he will have to pass for 100 years as a murderer Bhila, full of sores and boils, and for 7 births he will have to be a leper when at last he gets purified. Being born in this holy land, Bharata Varsa, if any man strikes a cow with a rod, or any driver does so, whether by himself or by his servant, he will have to dwell certainly in the hot Lauha Kunda for 4 yogas. He will have to pass as many years as a cow, as there are hairs on that cow, when ultimately he gets purified. If anybody strikes any other body with a red-hot iron dart Kunta weapon, he will have to dwell in the Kunta Kunda for a yuta years. Then he will have to remain for 1 birth in a good womb, with a diseased constitution, when ultimately he will be purified. If any Brahmin villain eats out of greed any flesh not sacrificed before the goddess, or anything not offered to Hari, he will have to remain in the Krimikunda, where he eats those things for as many years as there are hairs on his body. Then he will have to pass for 3 births as mlachas, when ultimately he becomes born in a Brahmin family. If any Brahmin performs the Shrad of a Sudra, eats the food pertaining to a Shrad of a food pertaining to the Shrad of a Sudra, or burns the dead body of a Sudra, he will have to dwell certainly in Puyakunda, where being beaten by the rod of Yama, he eats the pus, etc., for as many years as there are hairs on his body. Then he becomes reborn in this Bharata as one greatly diseased, poor, deaf, and dumb, and ultimately he will have to roam for 7 births as a Sudra. He who kills a black serpent, or whose hood there is the lotus mark, lives in Sarpa Kunda, for as many years as there are hairs on his body, and he is bitten by serpents there and beaten by the servants of Yama, and eats the excrescences of snakes, and finally becomes born as a serpent. Then he becomes a man short-lived and having the cutaneous disease and ringworm, and his death also comes out of snake bite. He who kills mosquitoes and other small-fanged animals then earn their substance that he who kills mosquitoes and other small-fanged animals that earn their substance rightly and pass so their lives goes to Damsa Masa Kunda, where he is eaten by mosquitoes and other fanged creatures, and lives there without food and crying, weeping for as many years as the numbers of lives destroyed. Besides, the Yama's servants tie his hands and feet and beat him. Then he becomes born as flies when ultimately he becomes purified. He who beats and chastises any man not fit to be chastised and beaten, and as well as Brahmana, goes to Vajra Damstra Kunda full of worms and lives there day and night for as many years as there are the number of hairs on the chastised person. When he is bitten by the worms and beaten by Yama's servants, he cries sometimes, weeps sometimes, and becomes very miserable. Next, he is reborn as a crow for 7 births, when ultimately he gets purified. If any foolish king punishes, and gives trouble to his subjects out of greed of money, he goes to Vrishchika Kunda, where he lives for as many years as there are hairs on the bodies of his subjects. There is no doubt in this. Finally, he becomes born in this Bharata as a scorpion, then a man diseased and defective in limbs, when ultimately he becomes freed of his sins. If any Brahmin carries or raises weapons, washes the clothes of others who do not perform sandhyas, and abandons his devotion to Hari, he lives in Saradi Kunda for as many years as there are hairs on his body. He is then pierced by arrows, finally becomes purified. If any king, maddened by his own folly and fault, shuts his subjects in a dark cell and kills them, then he will have to go to the dreadful dark hell filled with worms, having fanged teeth and covered with dirt. This hell is named Golakunda. He lives there, bitten by insects, for as many years as there are hairs on the bodies of his subjects. Finally, he becomes a slave of those subjects when he gets purified. If anybody kills the sharks and crocodiles, etc., that rise out of the water spontaneously, he will have to remain then in Nakrakunda for as many years as there are thorns or edged points on those animals. Then he will have to be born as crocodiles, etc., for some time, when he will be purified. If any man overpowered with lust sees another's wife's uncovered breasts, loins, and face, he will have to remain in Kakakunda for as many years as there are hairs in his own body. Here the crows take out his eyes. Finally, for 3 births he gets himself burnt by fire when he becomes pure. He who steals in India the gold of the Devas and the Brahmanas dwells certainly in Mantana Kunda for as many years as there are hairs on his body. My servants give him good beatings and cudgellings His eyes are covered by Matana Danda insects or animals, and he eats their dirty feces. Then he is reborn as a man, but for 3 births he becomes blind, and for 7 births he becomes very poor, cruel, and a sinful goldsmith, and then he is born a Swarna Vanik Sonarbini. O fair one, he who steals in India copper or iron, silver or gold, dwells in Vijakunda for as many years as there are hairs on his body. There the Vijas, a kind of insect, cover his eyes, and he eats the excrescences of those insects. My messengers torment him. Finally, he gets purified. If anybody steals in India any Devata or any articles of the Devata, he dwells in Vajrakunda for as many years as there are hairs on his body. There his body gets burnt up. My messengers torment him, and he cries and weeps and remains without any food. Then he gets purified. If anybody steals the metal, gold or silver, cows or garments of any deva or brahmana, certainly he dwells in hot pasana kunda for as many years as there are hairs on his body. Next, for 3 births, he becomes a tortoise and all sorts of white birds. Finally, for 3 births, he becomes a leper, and for 1 birth, he becomes a man with white marks on his body. Next, for 7 births, he becomes diseased with a severe colic pain and bad blood and lives short. Then he gets purified. If anybody steals brass or kamsya properties of any deva or brahmana, he will have to remain in the sharp pasana kunda for as many years as there are hairs on his body. Next, he becomes born in Bharata for 7 births as horses, and untimely his both the testicles get enlarged, and he gets diseases in his legs when he gets purified. If anybody verily eats the food of an adulterate woman or lives on her arms, he will have to go to the Lalakunda for as many years as there are hairs on his body. My messengers torment him there, and he eats the saliva and thus lives miserably. Then he gets eye diseases and colic when ultimately he gets purified. If any Brahmana lives on writing only, or on the service of Malachas, he lives in Masikunda very painfully, eating ink, tormented by my messengers for as many years as there are hairs on his body. Then he becomes a black animal for 3 births, and for another 3 births he becomes a black goat. Then he becomes a tal tree when he gets purified. If anybody steals a deva's or a brahmana's grains or any other good materials, betel, arson seat or bedding, he lives in Churnakunda for 100 years, tormented by my dutas, messengers. Next, for 3 births, he gets himself born as a goat, cock, and monkey. Finally becomes born as a man with the heart disease without any issue, poor and short-lived, when at last he gets purified. If anybody steals any Brahmin's property and thereby does chakra puja, the famous chakra circle, worship in tantra, or prepares a potter's wheel or any other wheels, he will have to go to Chakrakunda and remain there for 100 years, tormented by my messengers. Then he will be born for 3 births as an oilman suffering from very severe diseases, when he will ultimately be poor, without any issue and diseased. Finally, he gets purified. If anybody casts a sinful eye on any brahmana or on cows, he will have to remain in Vakrakunda for 100 yugas. Next, for 3 births, he becomes a cat. For 3 births, he becomes a vulture. For 3 births, he becomes a boar. For 3 births, he becomes a peacock. For 7 births, he becomes a man deformed and defective in limbs. His wife being dead without any issue. Finally, he becomes purified. If any person born in a Brahmin family eats the flesh of a tortoise, that is prohibited. He lives in Kurmakunda for 100 years, eaten by tortoises. Then he becomes for 3 births a tortoise, for 3 births a boar, for 3 births a cat, for 3 births a peacock, till at last he gets purified. If anybody steals clarified butter or oil of any devas or brahmana, he will have to go to Javala Kunda or Basma Kunda. That sinner remains in oil for 100 years and gets soaked through and through. Then for 7 births he becomes a fish and a mouse when he gets purified. If anybody born here in this holy land, Bharata, steals sweet scented oil of a deva or of a brahmana, the powdered Myairo Balan, or any other scent, he goes to Dagda Kunda, where he lives, burnt day and night for as many years as there are hairs on his body. For 7 births he becomes born emitting a nasty smell. For 3 births he becomes musk, mriga nabi. For 7 births as a matana insect. Then he becomes born as a man. If out of envy a powerful man appropriates to his purpose another's ancestral property by cheating, by using force, he goes to the hot Suchikunda, being tormented there like a jiva dropped in the midst of a very hot oil tank full of boiling oil. His body is then being burnt up severely as a result of his own karma. The wonder being that his body never gets completely destroyed nor reduced to ashes. For 7 manvantaras he lives there without any food. My messengers give him good beatings and cudgelings and chastise him. He cries aloud. Next he gets himself born as worms of feces for 60,000 years, when he becomes born as a pauper without owning any land. Thus that villain, getting a fresh lease of human birth, begins again to do fresh good acts. Here ends the 33rd chapter of the 9th book on the description of the destinies of different sinners in different hells in Srimad Devi Bhagavatam of 18,000 verses by Maharishi Vyasa. Om Jayanti Mangala Kali Bhadra Kali Kabai. Jai Mata Chupitatu.